Whew, there it is. I'm starting by preparing a clean surface and putting down some cardboard. All of these parts have been prepped for paint. Now I'm going through with a small bottle of mineral spirits, spraying it down and then wiping it clean with some shop towels. I'm not sure why, but these knobs, handles, and levers make me kind of nervous. I'm going to paint them over the workbench just in case one falls, it doesn't land on the concrete floor. The paint I'm using is made by Rust-Oleum. It's their farm and implement line of paints. I've used this paint before when restoring an old ATV, and I'm very happy with how it holds up. There is an aerosol can version, but I prefer the gallon can. It paints on nice, and I think it might actually be a bit better than the aerosol version. Oh, and here's a quick look at the ATV I restored. It turned out really nice. Sorry, I don't have a video on it. This was kind of before I started filming. The smaller parts get a full second coat, and then after that, some touch-up. One thing to note about applying the paint with a brush, it goes on very nicely on the cast metal. There's lots of pits and texture, and the brush marks more or less melt into that. You will not see the brush marks. But on the larger pieces of sheet metal, like on the far end of the table, you will see brush marks. Later in this video, I switched from the brush to a paint roller, and I had excellent results. Most of these pieces have red primer, followed by some black body compound or filler. Notice that I couldn't quite get all of it off entirely, and I don't really see the reason for it. Leaving that on there is fine. If it's still stuck on there after all the chemical insults I threw at it, it's gonna stay on there and it's gonna hold up just fine. Recoloring this tag went quite smoothly, but redoing the rest of them on the machine would be quite a bit more challenging. So I'm gonna leave that for a future date. I actually enjoy painting these smaller pieces. It's a lot of fine brushwork, and you'll notice I'm not taping anything off. The nice thing about bare metal is if you get a little paint on it, you can either wipe it off with a little bit of acetone or buff it off with some Scotch-Brite. Moving on to the large castings, I noticed that there was quite a bit of body filler missing in some spots. I started with some spot filler, but I wasn't quite happy with the results. It never got that hard, and I was worried about its durability. I removed most of that and then used Bondo instead. The Bondo dried much faster and also much harder than the spot filler. Once finished filling casting defects, I hand sanded all of the spots I was going to paint. Painting is so much more enjoyable than stripping. The off-gassing isn't nearly as bad, and the results are pretty immediate, and they look really cool in video. The key to any good paint job is all about surface prep. I don't show a lot of sanding in these videos, but there was quite a bit of sanding and scraping, trying to get the surface nice and even for paint. After all, the paint is not going to fill in any defects, it's just going to cover up the surface underneath. If you remember from the first video, I really didn't plan on taking off the change gear box, but dang it, if I had it off, I was going to clean it up as best I could and make that thing look like new. Something you often see with brushed on paint is drips. And that happens when you apply too much paint thinking that it's a body filler and not a coating. The paint isn't really going to offer any protection to the metal, it's just there to look nice and, if anything, provide a barrier to prevent rust. If you hit it with something, it's going to go right through the paint and down to the metal. Thick paint is just going to chip and look worse. All you want is a layer that is uniform, that covers whatever is underneath it. Well, that's the plan anyway. Approaching it this way, that means I am doing one very careful application of paint and then following up with a touch-up application, which is not a full application, just the large surfaces and then looking for any spots that I missed. I'm hustling to get this done as quickly as possible before the snow falls, putting in probably about 30 hours a week on top of my normal 40-hour-a-week job. And while I would love to be super focused on every little detail, I really have to manage my time carefully. That means the extra bit of time that I can spend is going to be on the parts that you touch or that you see. So anything really below the knee, I'm not going to be super concerned about getting perfect, but when you get up to eye level, that's worth the extra bit of time because that's something I'm going to see every time I touch the machine or turn it on. With several hours of sanding now behind me, a quick wipe down with a rag and mineral spirits is the final prep. This removes any dust and junk that I created sanding and also allows me to find a few little spots that I need to touch up with some sandpaper before painting. The paint went on nice and smooth. However, there is the temptation to keep touching it up when really once it's on, I just need to walk away and then come back at least 24 hours later. If I come back too soon and try to touch it up, the paint is going to be thick and the brush marks are going to stand out like crazy. And touching up too soon after an application, also, you run the risk of melting or re-liquefying the paint underneath the touch-up and then getting drips. There's still quite a bit more painting coming up, and I'm running out of things to say, so here is an excerpt from a Monarch manual. Clean lathe every day. In cleaning working parts of the lathe, do not use compressed air. Why? Compressed air drives particles and chips under the bearing surfaces, scoring and quickly ruining the bearings. To properly clean working parts, use a duster, brush, or cloth. Make this daily cleaning of the working parts of your lathe a part of your daily routine. Never allow the dirt to cake. The practice of laying tools and other objects across the ways is bad because the working parts are often injured in this way. In time, the efficiency of the lathe is greatly reduced. And there you go. Some good advice from 1940. Let's see what other good information we can find in the old literature. Here we go. Care and operation of the lathe. Most of the features of ease and convenience of operation of this machine have been suggested from time to time by lathe operators, and we always welcome suggestions and criticisms. This lathe is built of the very finest materials obtainable. All the steel operating parts are made of nickel alloy steel, electric furnace hardened, and the lathe is built to stand high speeds and heavy cuts, and with reasonable care and attention will stand up indefinitely to maximum service. In quotes, a good workman always takes pride in his tools, end quote. And we have tried in the building of this lathe to make it not only easy and convenient to operate, but also to look well. A weekly cleaning with a kerosene rag will give the finish a longer life. And here are some tips for operating the lathe. Changing spindle speeds. The levers on the front of the headstock are of course for changing spindle speeds. The levers move heavy jaw clutches inside the headstock in changing spindle speeds. In changing to slower speeds, it is not necessary to disengage the driving clutch, but we do always recommend disengaging the driving clutch before changing to higher speeds. This is especially advisable if there is a heavy chuck or heavy work on the spindle or between centers. With a collet chuck or with light work between centers on the lathe, it is not necessary to disengage the driving clutch in changing to higher speeds. In changing spindle speeds, the thing to watch is to avoid the sudden shock that would be imposed on the headstock mechanism in changing from low to higher speeds, with the driving clutch engaged and with a load on the spindle. With just a little care and practice in changing spindle speeds, any operator can soon learn to select any desired spindle speed and secure it almost instantly, even without referring to the spindle speed chart on the front of the headstock. Whoa, wait a minute. So I can drive a 6-speed manual with one shifting knob. They're telling me that back in 1940, someone would memorize the whole shifting pattern for 4 different knobs and every combination? That's kind of crazy. I don't know if I believe that. Okay, now I'm getting somewhere painting. So check this out. I switched from a brush to a foam roller. The foam roller I'm using is one of the thin trim rollers, and it is just perfect for painting large surfaces. The advantage is it lays down a nice, even layer of paint, fairly thick, but not so thick that it's going to drip. Also, the sheet metal pan gets a perfect finish using this roller. No brush marks. The trim roller is also the perfect size to fit between the tray and the motor cabinet. By now you might be wondering, how much paint does it take to paint a 5,000-pound lathe? Well, about 3 quarts actually. Or put another way, about 8 pounds. A quick tip about foam rollers. This oil-based paint dries so slowly that the roller can be placed in a Ziploc bag and used multiple times over several days. Stand next to it. You can see the size of this massive 5,000-pound lathe when compared to this 5'2" woman.
5'4".
5'4".
Shoes on, I'm more like 5'6".
Okay, making a lot of progress in still quite a few days. And now it's touch up. I'm gonna go through and touch up little things, get this thing ready for the move. Here's what I'm looking for. Haha, gotcha. So on here, you can see there's a few spots that aren't quite smooth. And what that is there was like a speck of rust or paint or something, and it didn't quite hold the paint uniformly. So we're gonna cover that up again. So my next step is just kind of walk around and touch up some spots. So here, there's some thin spots. Not too bad over here. I'm gonna go over the whole thing looking for places where there's just a little bit of stuff peeking through. A lot of these things are really hard to see without an inspection light. Like right in there, those spots are just about impossible to see back here. This will be the first round of touch-up. This will be the big round. After that, if I see something later, I'll just grab a little brush and a little acid brush and touch it up. But yeah, let's go to it. There's 2 little oil spots by the plugs down here. Just gonna do a quick 1-2 punch. Just a speck of acetone. The paint's only been on here for about 24 hours, maybe less, so it will come off pretty easily with acetone. And actually, you can see right here, look at that. Only the spot where the oil didn't allow the paint to adhere is coming off. That tells me there must have been some oil trapped underneath in the weld spatter that I couldn't see. And once the paint hit it, it solved it and then moved it out of the way. So that cleaned up nice. Next up, just a spritz of mineral spirits. And that's my preferred way to prep that surface for paint. Not too worried about how this looks. That's going to be covered up by a panel here anyway. Using a raking light, like this inspection light I had, really made this process smooth. A lot of these touch-ups wouldn't be visible without that light. I suppose you could argue I'd never see it anyway because I'm not going to be walking around with this light when I'm using the machine, but I've got this much time into it. What's another hour touching it up? Like I mentioned before, instead of doing a full second coat, I went over and did a touch-up coat. Originally, I planned on just kind of spot touching up with a paintbrush, but after really really developing a fondness for that paint roller, it almost turned into a full second coat. And I mean, why not? And that is a wrap on painting. Man, it's starting to look good. Thanks so much for sticking around, and I'll see you on the next video. Take care, guys.